And I'd just like to tell you a little bit about Jon Cicirelli before he speaks. Since 2003, Jon Cicirelli has been the director of the City Animal Care and Services Program in San Jose, California. Jon is also on the board of the California Animal Control Directors Association and is their state legislative coordinator. He began his career as an animal control officer in Arlington, Virginia in 1994. That's near Washington, D.C. His first experience as a director of an agency was in the city of San Bernardino, California. Bernardino. Jon has built community partnerships and implemented programs that have reduced the number of cats and kittens entering the San Jose shelter system by more than 25% in the last 4 years. Jon holds a bachelor's degree in biology from George Mason University and a master's of public administration. In 2011, he was recognized by the California State Assembly for achievements and meritorious service to the community. Will you please welcome Jon Cicirelli?
Thank you very much. I am fighting a little cold, so bear with me if I cough. Is this what I'm using to advance it? Perfect. Okay, so San Jose, in case you don't know, just so you can get a sense of where I'm coming from, is just south of San Francisco, maybe an hour south in terms of a drive from San Francisco. We serve a human population of a little over 1 million people. Pretty diverse community, about half white, half Asian, and half Latino. So a lot of our communication is done in those 3 languages. Primarily in the Asian language, it is Vietnamese. We have one of the largest Vietnamese populations outside of Vietnam, is in San Jose. San Jose is also known as the Silicon Valley area. So when you hear people talking about all the tech giants and the big companies, San Jose is right in the center of all of that. We have a very mild climate. The temperatures rarely go below freezing at all at any time during the year. When they do, it's front page news. Everybody's losing their mind. And that means that cats survive very well in our environment, and they breed twice a year. They're very good to us. So we're just now finishing, of course, the summer, which is the end of the second cycle of cats that we get. So we get a lot of kittens throughout the spring and summer. And so we estimate by using a variety of calculations that there's about 400,000 cats in our area, in our service area. And that includes both the cats that are owned by people, and that includes the cats that are just free roaming and feral and stray. So, what do we do? So we're a government animal control agency. Just like you have compliance officers, we are animal control officers. So we enforce the laws, both local laws, state laws. There aren't many national or federal laws that we would enforce, but the book on the state laws that regulate both what we can do and both the laws that we have to enforce is about 1.5 inches thick. I don't know what that is in centimeters, but you can see. It's complex and sometimes contradicts itself. I heard in the other session before, or one of the questions to the speakers, about who's pursuing legislation. And I can tell you from my limited research I've done in Australia, you guys should be pursuing legislation. You should focus on changing some of the things that are out there that may be limiting your ability to perform better in this industry here in Australia. We, of course, are very concerned with things like health and safety. Yesterday in the all-day session, I did a talk with Todd, the guy who spoke earlier this morning, about what animal control is like. And one of the things we talked about is rabies, which is not a significant concern here, but is a very significant concern in the States. And so that tends to be the basis of why animal control even exists in most cases in America. And it's to control the spread or prevent the spread of rabies, primarily from dogs to human beings. We, of course, do all the other things that a large animal shelter does, finding new homes for animals. We have a lot of citizen complaints and concerns that we have to worry about. We reunite lost pets with their owners, and try to reduce the suffering caused to animals or find new outcomes for them. And lastly, we try to control overpopulation or stray animal control, and that's really what I'm going to focus on today, particularly as it relates to cats. So here's sort of a traditional looking animal shelter, at least in America. I haven't been to any animal shelters in Australia, but I assume they aren't too different. Rows and rows of cages. chain link or bars, however you want to do it. Dogs sort of segregated, either in small groups or individually. In some cases, many rows of these. Our shelter is quite large. It's over 50,000 square feet, which I think would be something like, I don't know, 15 or 20,000 square meters. I'm not sure how that calculates out, but it's large. We take in 17,000 animals a year. About half of those are dogs and half of those are cats. So it's a big operation. It covers a lot of territory. And somewhere along the way, even though we were primarily came about for rabies control largely in dogs, we started as an industry dealing with cats as well. And so, typical classic government solution, we just replicated the dog model. And there you see, this is how we tend to keep cats in animal shelters. Rows and rows and rows of cages, all crammed in together. We sort of have to ask ourselves, and we have been over the last several years, particularly around cats, is why do we take them in at all? In California, we have a strange set of laws that sort of contradict themselves, but most of the shelter intake, in any shelter really, is complaint driven. It's, there's usually one of two reasons someone's bringing a stray or feral cat into your facility, and it's because either they're annoyed by it or they're worried about it. So it's a concern or a complaint about the animal. And as we go around, typically the common way we handle these is we'll hold them for a few days in the hope that an owner's going to show up and reclaim them, and most don't, as we all know. And then eventually we end up euthanizing. So it's a very costly way to sort of try to manage this. And the only comparison I can make is if you were trying to manage some wild animal problem in a neighborhood or in a community, you wouldn't manage it this way. Nobody would think of this scheme as a way to manage wild animals. And I know there's been some mention, we talk about, well, maybe we need to think about cats as being wild animals, and maybe we can, and that's not what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, but this kind of a management system doesn't make sense financially, and I'll show you some numbers in a little bit. And then on top of all that, the number of cats that you're taking into any animal shelter is so small in comparison to the number of cats that are out there in the community. Remember, I told you we estimate there's about 400,000 cats in our communities that we serve. We take in about 8,500 cats, less than 9,000 a year. So when you really look at that as a percent of how many cats are out there, most shelters take in maybe 3%, 4% of the total cat population in a given year. So if you're really trying to do population control through shelter admission and euthanasia, you're not doing anything about it, frankly. You're spinning your wheels, and you're wasting a lot of time, money, and effort because that 3 or 4% is quickly filled right back in by the remaining 96 or 7% that are still out there. And we sort of started coming to these conclusions a few years ago and started questioning, well, why are we doing it this way? The problem that we've had in America is that typically when you start in this business, you tend to start at some level. I started as an officer, in the street picking up animals, and you're just taught this is how it works. And generally, you don't really question it. You just think, well, that's what I'm supposed to do. Somebody that knows a lot more than me and is higher up in the organization told me that's why we do it, so we do it that way. And you do it that way long enough, you forget to even think about why you're doing it that way. And thankfully, I hired a shelter manager, well, now 5 years ago. And I remember when I hired her, I was doing the second interview before I was making my final decision, and I told her, look, we're doing all these things to try to help cats, and yet our cat intake is still going up. And I explained to her all the things we were doing at the time, which at the time were all the things you're supposed to do, and I'll explain to you some of those in a little bit. And she looked at, and I said, well, what are you going to do different? What would we do different if we hired you? And she just sort of looked at me blankly and thought, well, I don't know. And then she said, we could just let them all go. I thought, well, I don't know about that. But I hired her anyways. But we started challenging some of our assumptions. For instance, we assume that if we target the owners of cats with spay and neuter, we're going to reduce shelter intake. Now, to some degree, that works. But when you really look at the breakdown of the types of two basically two types of cats that are in a community, owned and unowned. They're almost in equal proportions. There's slightly more owned usually than not, but it breaks down fairly evenly. And so in most cases, including here in Australia, owners are pretty good about spaying and neutering their cats. Now there's a paper I think being presented tomorrow, that'll talk about some of those things and the fact that people don't do it quick enough, right? So people will eventually desex their cat, but not before it has at least a litter. And there's a variety of reasons that we'll talk about that. Although I would suggest to you the reason then why people desex their cats after it's had a litter is because they find out how annoying a cat can be when it's not spayed and neutered. And you start running out of friends and family to give kittens to, and the people at the office and everything, all of a sudden it's a problem, and so you decide it's a lot easier for me to desex the cat. We also assume, though, and so the point there being is that even if you do a really good job targeting owners of cats, you're missing a huge chunk of cats. And that volume of cats that's out there is responsible for a large % of the intake that's coming into your animal shelter. So targeting people with spay neuter isn't the way out of the cat problem in an animal shelter. It's one of the pieces, but there's a whole lot more to it. We also assume, of course, that people are going to come looking for the cat. That's why we hold them, right? We're holding them for some period of time in the hopes that somebody's going to come pick them up. But in fact, we find, in particular in California, the average owner reclaim rate for a cat is 2%. A really good one's like 15 or 20%. And so even in really good situations, and those tend to be very small shelters in nice little areas, but even in really good situation, you're still left with the other 80% or more. And in our case, more than 95%. What are you going to do with them? And I believe I read in one of the papers that it's about 4% on average here in Australia. So it's the same exact problem. There's just not that many people that are going to come in. But for some reason, we operate as if this is what's going to happen. That's why we have these holding periods. But if you really think about it, it doesn't make sense to have a holding period. You're holding 100% of the cats so that maybe 3 or 4% of them will find a home. So the other 95, 6, 7% of them, you're just holding them for nothing because nobody's coming. And then we also have an assumption that if they are in the shelter, we'll be able to find them a home and adopt them out. And for those of you who've dealt with feral cats, you know how ridiculous that is. So these are things, though, that we tend to build our programs around, that these things will happen, or that the public will assume that these things are happening. A lot of people bring cats in and they don't really think through the process of what's going to happen to this cat. They want to give it to you for some reason. It's annoying or they're worried about it, but they don't really think through, well, what might happen to it. So cats really are the square peg in the round hole in an animal shelter. I have the strays in there for you Kiwis because you call feral cats strays. We call them feral or wild. But, and they're almost uniformly euthanized in animal shelters. So the solutions we have that largely are based on a dog model don't work for cats in animal shelters. And so we started to see that. And we started to finally say, well, enough is enough. This is not working. And we were fairly desperate to try to find something different. And we were lucky to stumble over a solution, frankly. So at the time when we were sort of wringing our hands about what to do, and I just hired this new shelter manager, we were taking over 11,000 cats a year. We were running really good low-cost desexing clinics. You could, anybody, no income qualification, anybody in any of the areas we served could get a male cat neutered for $5 and a female for $10. Anytime, you could walk in and do it. We operate 5 days a week, all days of the week. So you just walk, drop them in the morning, pick them up on your way home from work at night. No problem. We're happy to do it. We worked, and still do, of course, with a lot of nonprofit rescue groups. We have over 60 groups that work with our shelter, but they largely take kittens. They don't take adult cats that much because adult cats take more time to place usually. So they don't take a whole lot of adult cats. They mostly take the kittens, which they can then raise, and they're pretty easy to sell. Our own city council, which is our government, supported the elected officials themselves, wrote what's called a resolution. A resolution is not a law, but it's basically a public policy statement. And we got them to sign off, including our mayor, to say, hey, we support trap, neuter, return. We want to encourage the community to use our low-cost services to help control cat overpopulation in our community. So politically, we had the support we wanted. We're doing all kinds of adoption promotions, things you were hearing about earlier today. I mean, heck, we give away cats free every year in the summer because we have so many. Every year we'll just give away kittens, hundreds and hundreds of kittens, free of charge. And of course, we were running foster programs too for the young ones to make sure they get. So we felt like we were doing everything right, yet our euthanasia rate was still 70% for cats. And it's because largely the cats that were coming in were the feral cats or the offspring of feral cats. So then we started to ask ourselves, well, what are the laws about any of this stuff in our state? So where is the law that says we have to pick up a healthy stray cat? I'll spare you the expense, there isn't one. And where's the law that says just because someone shows up on our doorstep with a cat and it's healthy, that says we have to take it in? Once again, there isn't one. Or that if an owner doesn't want their cat anymore, that we have to take it? There isn't one, no law. Or that once we do take a cat and we can't find a home to put it in, that we have to then euthanize it because we don't have any other options. Again, those laws don't exist. But we operated as if they did. And in fact, that tends to be how we operate as organizations in this industry, whether we're in America or other countries where we have shelter systems. We tend to operate as if these are things or constraints upon us. But when you really look at the details, you find out those constraints really aren't there. And in fact, in some communities in California, I've actually seen laws that exclude cats from being impounded into the animal shelter, except in very specific circumstances. So in California, animal control agencies are only obligated to take in cats that are in specific need of help. So it's injured, it's sick, it's an orphan baby that doesn't have a mother and can't care for itself, or it has bitten a human being and needs to be quarantined, and that's associated with rabies, which is something you guys probably don't have to worry much about. But outside of those four categories, we don't have to really do anything else about cats if we don't want to. But we operate as if we have to do everything for cats. And most of the laws, when you read them, when it comes to cats, and in some cases dogs, a lot of the laws, people will interpret them to say you have to pick up a cat, a stray cat, let's say. Say you have a law. We have a law, for example, in San Jose, a local law. For lack of a better phrase, it's a leash law, but it just says that if you own a cat, it cannot roam off your property. Well, that law doesn't say that if the cat roams off the property, our officer has to go pick it up. What the law says is our officer's authorized to pick it up if it walks off the property, meaning there's authority given to take it, but there's nothing required to do it, right? So the officer can look at the guy and go, well, I don't need to pick him up, and they don't have to pick him up. That's a policy choice, and it's not a legal choice. And frankly, leash laws for cats are a little bit silly if you think about it. I mean, it's kind of difficult to enforce a leash law for cats. Thankfully, in our community, even though we have a leash law, I run the government agency responsible for enforcing the leash law, so we don't have to worry so much about the leash law. Some of you might not have that advantage. So this is what it costs. So this is our budget. What year are we in? 14. It's 2 years ago now, I guess. Geez. So our budget was $6.5 million that year, 13-14. That year we took in 8,600 and change of cats. So about a third of our budget goes towards cats. The other 2/3 go towards dogs. Dogs are much more expensive for us to deal with, particularly from the animal control side, you know, the officers in the field and stuff. So that breaks out roughly to a cost of about $225 for cats on average for every cat that comes in. Some cost a lot more, some cost less. But that's not out of line with any of your standards or anybody else's. I've seen much higher numbers and I've seen somewhat lower numbers. Some of it's driven by cost of living, depending on what area of the country you live in. If you're in an area where the cost of living is lower, the cost might be a bit lower, but it's all relative. But at any rate, I think one of the things you're going to hear in some of the papers that are being presented in this conference is the idea that if you euthanize 50% of the cats, you may be able to control their population. There's been some studies done that, you know, nobody's actually really tried to do that on a large scale. They've tried it on very, very small scales in closed systems, but nobody's tried it on a large scale, primarily because of that number on the bottom, which is if we were to just try to do that for 1/4, 1/4, or 100,000 of those cats, not even close to half, For 1 year, it would cost us nearly $23 million to do that, the way we operate now. Well, you can see our whole budget's $6.5 million. And I don't know about you guys here in Australia, but in my country, they're not going to spend $23 million to go exterminate a bunch of cats. And if they had an extra $23 million, they wouldn't give it to me. They'd give it to the police department, they'd give it to the fire department, everybody else. But they're certainly not going to just hand $23 million to me. So it's a little bit unrealistic when you hear things like, it was somebody in the ministry here saying they want to, pick up and kill off 2 million cats, right? Well, how are you going to pay for that? Who's going to do that? I mean, it gets a little silly. Yeah, it's a soundbite and some politics going on there, but in reality, people see the dollar signs that it would take to do that. Nobody's going to want to spend that kind of money to do that kind of stuff. And even if you did, who are you going to find to pay to do it? There's not a lot of people, certainly nobody in this room, I would think, is going to go run around, just pick up every cat they see and exterminate it. So we tend to be, at least in America, and I think here too, we tend to be the ones in the middle of the crosshairs of this. On the one side, there's folks saying, save every cat, and then there's some people, particularly people who want to do things like protect birds or who are really annoyed at the cat who's using their garden for a bathroom and say, get rid of the cats, and we're right in the crosshairs, right in the middle. And this is what we started feeling like an extermination service, because all we were doing was marching 70% of that 11,000 plus cats straight in and then straight to death after holding them for several days, waiting for nobody to come, and spending all that money to do nothing. And we were very frustrated, and we said, we're not going to do that anymore. And so we stopped. And so what we came up with was a program we now call Spay, Neuter, and Release. And this was based on a model we found in Jacksonville, which some of you may or may not have heard of already. They were the first ones to pioneer it. Jacksonville, as it turns out, is on the whole other side of our country, but they're close in size to us in terms of population. And they just started it the year before, and the shelter manager had heard about it and came to me that winter during the downtime, if you will, and said, hey, I've heard about this program. And basically what they do is once the cats come into the shelter, if you decide they're feral, but if they're healthy, instead of euthanizing them, you just spay and neuter them or desex them, give them shots and take them right back to where they came from. And I thought, well, that sounds crazy. I don't know if that's something we can do. And so I was very worried about it. In America, a lot of our jobs in government are protected by unions, and you can kind of screw up at your job, but you'll still keep your job. My job is not like that. As the head of the agency, I'm what's called an at-will employee, and I'm subject to the political machinations of the world, and my boss could actually just walk in tomorrow and say, we don't need your services anymore, John, go away. And I wouldn't have any right to get my job back or anything like that. They don't have to have a reason to get rid of me. And that's just part of being an executive in government. And I'm okay with that risk because I don't feel like I make horrible decisions. But this one had me a little worried because I thought, well, people are going to freak out if we start just taking cats back all the time. And so I said, well, let's try it as a pilot program. I'll call it a pilot. That'll provide me the cover that if it blows back on my face, I can go, oh, well, we were just experimenting around. We can stop. And I would save my job. But why do we do it? Well, First and foremost, we want to reduce the number of cats out there. And this is one of the areas where I find some frustration when it comes to groups, particularly groups around birds where there seems to be a lot of emotion and concern. They want the cats gone. We do too. We do not want them running around outside. We want cats that live with people to live with people in their homes. And we want all the other cats not to be running around outside loose. We just have a different idea about how to get there. And it's interesting when you talk with the folks who are trying to protect birds, they sort of come up with this brilliant idea of getting rid of the cats. But they don't give you any money to do it. They don't give you any ideas on how to do it. The only idea they have in their mind is euthanize them when they're in the shelter. And they want us to do it for them. And it's sort of like, well, you should participate more in the process rather than simply being critical from afar. But you don't see too many Audubon bird groups or anything like that giving money to programs to help prevent cats from being born or anything like that. Obviously, in just about every animal shelter, but particularly in government animal shelters, time and space is limited, right? It's difficult to move that many animals. In particular for us, in the summer, when we're very full, it gets very difficult to cram all those animals in the shelter. So you want to be able to relieve some pressure in the shelter. And in California, we have a very interesting law. I don't think you have one like this here, but you should consider it. But in our state, there's a law that says if we have an animal, dog or cat, in our shelter, and there's a legitimate nonprofit animal rescue group, what we call a 501c3, but they don't have to be, but 501c3 is really a tax designation, so they're, as a nonprofit, they don't have to pay certain taxes. But anyway, if you have a legitimate nonprofit animal rescue organization that's working with you or just contacts you and says, hey, well, if you're going to just euthanize that cat or dog, then I want you to give it to me. We have to. We're required to hand it over. In fact, the only time in which we can't do that is if we have some kind of history, in particular as it relates to dogs, of biting. You know, if the dog had bit somebody in the past or something like that, and we have some recorded history that says this dog could be pretty dangerous. But outside of that fairly limited window, if they want them, they can have them. And we actually use that law to our advantage with the feral cats, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And of course, the only reason we're euthanizing feral cats in our shelters, it's not because they're sick. It's because they just don't make great pets. They're not going to sit on your lap. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, because we don't really have a different option for them. Well, frankly, that's not a great reason. Okay, you know, you can be a jerk and still live. So we're a primary participant in this, the government. We're the ones that actually got this started with our community, with our rescue groups that work with us. And so because the cats are coming into the facility, and we have this big facility and a spay-neuter clinic, we do the desexing and the vaccination up front while they're still in the system. In fact, we do it during their holding period. In California right now, you're required to hold animals for at least 3 days, presumably so that an owner can find them. Now that works better with dogs. You know, about 30% in our shelter are rehomed. The dogs go back home, but like I mentioned before, only 2% of the cats do. And again, the reason is because no one's looking for the feral cat. There isn't an owner involved. So at any rate, during those 3 days, we're actually doing all those medical services because the law doesn't say we can't, right? So, there are people that think, well, you can't do anything to the animal until it's through its holding period, because then it's only then it's truly yours and you can do something to it. But that's not what our law says. The only thing our law says is you have to hold it for 72 hours. You can't kill it until at least 72 hours has elapsed after it's been in the shelter. That's all our law says right now. So that means I can do anything else but kill it. So we spay, neuter, vaccinate, do whatever we want, ear tip them, everything. We put in microchips because we wanted to be able to track them. So it's a little bit of an extra expense, but it's an important one, and it helps with some data. We do not support releasing to environmentally sensitive areas. So we do have some bayland area, and we choose different ways to manage those cat populations and try to get them out of there. But we won't work, and right up front in the agreement, because I knew this is a flashpoint with folks who are concerned about wildlife. You know, if we have any official designated areas or areas that are set aside specifically for, you know, we have these things called burrowing owls. They literally live in the ground, but they're little tiny owls. They're the cutest little things. But of course, if you're living in the ground as a bird, you're more susceptible to being attacked by a cat. And these are an endangered animal in our area. And we set aside specific pieces of land so that they have a little space to dig their little holes and live out their lives. So we don't allow cats to be released there. And I do want to make an important distinction between the word release and the word return. These are cats that are returned to where they came from. They are not released to new locations. Those are two very different things. And I should have done that in my presentation, but I just want to be sure you understand that's what's going on here. And then the nonprofit that we partner with, they're the ones that actually come to the shelter each evening. They pick up however many cats we have ready to go back home, and they go back and return them to the neighborhoods where they came from, and then they put little door hangers on the houses that are immediately to the left or right of wherever the cat was released, or if it's a business. And then they maintain a website and a phone line. The phone line, it's just an answering line, so they'll return your call with all the information about what the program is, why we've chosen to use this program, and why this cat's missing part of its ear now as part of the program, et cetera, so that people know what's going on when a cat shows back up. We also, by the way, when a cat is turned into our facility, the person's required to fill out some information about the cat to tell us where they found it, who they are themselves, what they might know about the cat. And they're also required to sign a statement that says, among other things, but I'll paraphrase here for time, says that this cat may be adopted, it may be euthanized, it may be returned to where, it may be spayed, neutered, and returned to where it came from, et cetera, et cetera. So we tell them up front in a statement that they have to sign that they acknowledged reading the statement that any one of these things could happen with this cat. So which cats really go into the program, and I'm not going to go too into detail on the sort of the hows of the program because that's going to be presented in another presentation, I think tomorrow. But it's important to note they have to be healthy cats. We're not sending sick cats back out there. The reason they have to be healthy is because if a feral cat comes into you, an unowned cat that's not friendly, but is otherwise healthy, the health of their body is telling you a lot of information. It's telling you they've figured out how to find food and they've figured out how to live and have shelter. So you don't have to figure those things out for them anymore. We don't have to feel like we have to provide more of that for them. They got that sorted out on their own. And as do the few hundred other thousand cats that are out there. But that's not something we're going to concern ourselves with. We're just going to concern ourselves with the birth control side of it. We just want to stop you to stop making cats. They do have to be a little bit older. We won't send young kittens out there unless specifically the mother cat is there or specifically there's a person that's going to keep a tab on them and to be sure that they can survive in whatever environment they are. So, for example, if a person brought in, a 3-month-old kitten, we might say to them, well, it's not friendly. By 3 months, if we haven't been working with it socially, as many of you know, we're kind of losing the battle here in terms of socializing this cat for adoption. So, but we're not going to return it unless you can keep an eye on it and make sure that it's going to thrive, because we don't want to put it in a situation where it's too young to figure out how to get by in life. And as I mentioned before, the environmentally sensitive areas are important. This is another important aspect. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but there are people out there that don't want the cats returned, without a doubt. And in fact, there was a survey done. I don't know if anybody will talk about it on any other presentations. I don't have it in this one specifically, but it was done just a few years ago in America. It was a telephone survey, but they said, if you knew that a stray cat you saw on the street, if you knew that if you took that cat into the shelter that it would be put down, it would be euthanized, would you, A, still bring it into the shelter, or would you just leave it where it was? And 81% of people surveyed said they'd just leave it alone if they knew the outcome was that it was going to die in the animal shelter, rather than take it into the animal shelter. So there's still another 10 or 15% of people that are jerks, but most people are really good. And what we found with this program is that most people really do care. And they're not most of them don't want to feel responsible for a cat's death. They've got a problem with the cat, but they don't want to feel like they're the reason why the cat has to die. And so this slide really is about, you have to empower the people who are having a problem, who are being annoyed by the cat. You have to give them the information and the tools to not be annoyed by the cat, right? If it's coming in the garden and using the garden as a bathroom and that's annoying to them, there are ways to discourage cats from going to the bathroom in the garden. And you have to be able to provide them those tools. This little thing down here, this cat stop, is an ultrasonic device. It's a motion-activated ultrasonic device. Now, like any deterrent, none of them work 100% on any animal, whether it's dogs or cats. We were just talking about feel away and other things in the previous session. But there's a variety of deterrents to try, and some of them will literally just lend out to someone who's really complaining and say, look, just stick it in there, give it a few days or a few weeks and see how it works. And if it works, great, go buy your own and give us ours back. If it doesn't, we'll teach you something else to try. But it's more about helping them sort of manage their annoyance than it is saying, well, in order to solve your problem, we're just going to kill off the cat. So you just can't leave them helpless. That's the point I'm trying to make here, is you really have to support that person who's having a nuisance problem. Otherwise, they're just going to get upset and frustrated with you because in 2 or 3 days, the cat's going to be right back. Now, the nice thing is, because it's been desexed, a lot of the annoying stuff they do will diminish over the next few months, particularly the toms and the spraying and the fighting, and of course the females aren't going to be producing kittens, which is annoying. This is more about our partnerships. You can see catcenter.org is the website that they maintain. This is through our volunteer. But this, I just have this here to say that it's important to leverage the partnerships of others out in the community. As a government agency, we can't do it all. You know, we grabbed a partner, one of our nonprofit groups out there, and said, look, work with us. You guys want to save cats as much as we do. Let's work together. You have this piece of it. We have that piece of it. And we got a lot more support from the public than we thought. And as the head of the agency, I virtually never get complaints from cats. It never gets to my level anymore. Initially, when we started the program, there were a few complaints and a few things we had to resolve. But for the most part, the community is on board with it because communities do care, and they don't like the solution, the idea of the solution of just extermination of cats. They just don't know that there are other solutions. And I just want to quickly point out what this program is not. It's not managing colonies of cats and groups of cats. We're not going, after the cats return, we're not going back out to feed it or anything like that. It's not the relocation of cats. So we're not moving them to new places. It's not limiting their admission into the animal shelter. We're still taking all the cats in. We're just doing something different with them at the end instead of euthanizing them. And it's not abandonment, something that commonly comes up. Abandonment, when you look at almost all cruelty or abandonment laws, they almost uniformly have a willful aspect to it. You'll say things like someone does something knowingly or willfully, right? So that's called intent. You're intending to harm the animal. Nobody can guarantee a great life for an outdoor cat. It's not the best life, right? Although, as you'll see, many cats are quite healthy and live many, many years outdoors just fine. But some of them are going to get run over by cars. They're occasionally going to get eaten by a dog, or in our case, a coyote, in your case, a dingo. So those things are going to happen if the cats go outside. That's whether the cat's feral or owned. If you're an owner and you let your cat in and out, it's exposed to the exact same risk. We can't change that risk for them, except that when you desex them, you actually reduce their probability of getting certain diseases that are primarily transmitted due to sexual activity. So you actually can improve their health, not to mention when you have them in your hands, you throw a few extra vaccines in them to make sure they got something in them, which they never would have had before. And abandonment is about depriving an animal of care. It's not giving it care. We're not about caring. All we're doing is not providing care. We're just taking a few pieces out and putting them back. That's all we're doing. And so it's already being cared for. And if its condition is healthy at the time of the assessment, and a veterinarian is the one that's ultimately going to make that choice, because they're not going to operate on an animal that's not healthy to do a spay or neuter surgery, well, then you have an expert that's already said it was a healthy animal when we had it. So, the abandonment argument doesn't really hold water when you get down to it. And I think I'm running out of time here. So other folks are going to talk about some of this stuff. You're going to hear some, particularly about the health of cats, I think actually later this afternoon from Dr. Dale. So I won't go into that kind of stuff. Really quick, you can see how the intake changed. And you can see at the top of that chart, that's 3,000 fewer cats that we have to handle every year. Now think about the resources that frees up to do other things. This program changed our organization in ways we never even thought possible. We knew that cat intake would likely go down. We knew, of course, that euthanasia would go down, and it did, you can see. Cats in the blue, those are adult cats. The red or purple there are the kittens. And this is a program that was targeting cats. And so you can see how quickly the euthanasia of cats dropped because we started giving them a different outcome. But look at what happened with the kittens. That was fewer and fewer kittens being born outside, which meant fewer and fewer kittens coming into the animal shelter. So even though it was a program designed for cats, it had a wonderful effect on kittens as well. But the capacity we had that we found by not having to care for 3,000 more cats allowed us to do, you see that middle one, euthanasia due to upper respiratory, down 99%. Our incidence of upper respiratory infection didn't change dramatically. But what happened was we had the capacity to care for cats with a cold. I mean, it's a horrible reason to kill someone for a cold. We all get colds. I'm recovering from a cold right now. I certainly don't want to be killed for that. It's a bad reason to have to kill an animal. But in shelters, particularly high volume shelters, it's contagious. It gets into everything, and you just don't have the space to sit on them for 7 to 10 days, right? So it becomes a space problem. You can't cycle them through fast enough, and it blocks up the system. Well, take 3,000 cats out of the situation, and now all of a sudden you've virtually eliminated euthanasia for upper respiratory infections as a reason for euthanasia at all. And it totally didn't anticipate that or think that that was going to happen, but our capacity changed. The other interesting one was the dead cats. You can see down 19%. We're the agency responsible for picking up all the dead animals off the roads in our community. I didn't even think that this metric would, it didn't even occur to me until I was looking at metrics about this at one point, and I started realizing, oh look, over the same period of time, all this intake and all these kittens coming in and this program has been in effect, the number of cats we're picking up dead off the street is going down. So none of this says foolproof, no problem, and I did write a paper, it's in on your thumb drive, about it that has a lot more detail about the statistics, but none of this foolproof says absolute cause and effect with this program. But when you start adding all this stuff up, it's really the only major program we changed, and all these things started happening. I don't think it's a coincidence. And so lastly, I would just explain a couple different things here about why it might be working. These are my thoughts. I am not a PhD, I'm not a veterinarian, but in the United States, there are control programs for coyotes, and it's primarily because of they attack livestock, particularly young livestock right after they're born. So cattle ranchers, sheep ranchers, those kind of folks, the babies are born, the coyotes will come in and take them. And so they're trying to protect the ranching industry, and so they have these programs where they'll go out literally over a period of several years, killed 1 million coyotes, and they'll just shoot them dead on site wherever they can find them. So in Nevada, they were going through there and they killed a whole bunch of coyotes. And this guy who's an ecologist out in Nevada was observing the coyotes in the year following this culling that happened where they killed off a bunch of coyotes. And what he saw was that the female coyotes in the year after started having bigger litters, and those litters survived better. And it was because they were killing off individuals, but the resources in the environment stayed the same. So what you had was fewer coyotes that had access to more resources, which meant their survivability went up. And they responded ecologically very quickly to this pressure on them. And you yourselves have a study that just got published this year down in the Tasmanian Department of Primary Industries. And they were trying to figure out, well, how many cats can you kill out of a group of cats to try to see something go down? And it totally flipped what they thought their hypothesis was. They thought they would be able to come to some number to be able to say, well, if you get to a certain amount, there'll be fewer cats. And what they found was the population responded for the very same reason I just explained to you, I believe, in coyotes. They can only hypothesize why it did, but in fact, the population of cats increased over time. And then when they finally just left it alone for a while, what did it do? Went back to equilibrium, basically back to where they started. Because cats are very responsive to environmental pressures. That's how they're designed. That's why they have litters. So I think I'm out of time, but you can look at some of these things in terms of how you do this in your own community. If you're not the government agency, how do you build trust with the government agency to start trying some of these things? You want to work with them first and show examples of success. One of the big things is getting data, and I know that's an issue in some cases around. I certainly highly encourage anybody who works for local council, make your data available publicly. While it might be difficult initially, because there may be some criticism associated with that because the numbers aren't as great as you might like them to be, it creates an awareness and an accountability I think that is important, particularly in government. In America, we're very into public records requests and transparency. So any of this data, even if I didn't publish this data, which I do, we publish all our data on our website every year. Even if I didn't, anybody in the community could just write a letter or pick up a phone and say, give me the data, and I'd have to give it to them. That's just a law in America. But knowing what's going on and knowing the data and then measuring results once you do it are very important. And so if you were to walk out on the street today and ask one of these people walking by here on vacation, how many days do you have to hold an animal in an animal shelter in Australia? Virtually no one would know. Everybody in this room might know. But outside of our little niche, and it is little as an industry, people really don't know what to do about dogs and cats in society. But we do. And what we found was that in the past, what we were teaching our society was bring them into us, we'll get rid of them for you. And they went, okay, that's how it works. And when we stopped doing that and said, bring them in, we'll take care of the problem in a different way, in a humane way, they said, okay, that's how it works. Because that's what people are going to say. They're looking to you for your leadership on these things. So I encourage you to do so. Thanks.